Hello, I'm Yoram Hazony, and this is NatConTalk, where nationalism and conservatism meet. If you are enjoying our videos, you can help us out by hitting the like button and subscribing to this channel. Today we're going to be speaking with David Brog. He's the president of the Edmund Burke Foundation and the author of a terrific book, In Defense of Faith. David Brog, welcome to NatConTalk.
Yoram, great to be with you.
David, it's just terrific to have you. What it's been at this point, we can count the decades, right? It's an entire generation since you and I met as undergraduates at Princeton University. And here we are all these years later, partners at the Edmund Burke Foundation, rejuvenating national conservatism, so we hope. And we'll get to all of that, but I want to just start at the beginning of your story and ask you to tell a little bit about how a Jewish kid from Atlantic City ended up being, for an entire decade, the executive director of Christians United for Israel, one of the most important Christian organizations in America, but you're Jewish. How did this happen? Doesn't happen to everybody.
Well, I met this guy in college named Yoram Hazony who had an influence upon me, and I think created a space in my mind for conservative ideas and skepticism of a lot of what I encountered at Princeton and in my education after Princeton. So I think I was prepared for this moment when I was working for a guy named Arlen Specter, senator from Pennsylvania. And I was his chief counsel, eventually his chief of staff. And I think James Carville, the political pundit, best described Pennsylvania. He said it was a strange state. You have Philly in the east, Pittsburgh in the west, and Alabama in between. And central Pennsylvania is very much an oddity in the northeast of the United States. It is, in fact, very rural, very Christian, and very conservative. And as a Northeastern Jewish kid, I ended up spending a lot of time in central Pennsylvania working on Arlen Specter's reelection. And for the first time in my life, I really encountered and spent a lot of time with evangelical Christians. And this is in the late 90s and early 2000s. And these evangelical Christians kept telling me how very much they loved Israel and how very much they loved me as a Jew. And I remember my reaction to this outpouring of love for me and my people in the Jewish state. And I'm ashamed of my reaction, frankly. My reaction was baloney. For 2,000 years, you people, you Christians, chased us, murdered us, converted us at the point of a sword. And now you tell me you love me? I don't believe it. I don't buy it. But then I got to know them, and I got to realize these were really beautiful people, and they were quite sincere. And I grew ashamed of my reaction because I realized, wasn't I doing to evangelical Christians exactly what prior generations of Christians had done to our ancestors in Europe, which was judging people they did not know, judging a faith they knew absolutely nothing about, and condemning people for a stereotype misunderstanding of that faith. I didn't know anything about Christianity. I didn't know anything about evangelicals, but here I was judging them on the basis of stereotypes. I knew nothing about them. And I realized I was committing the very sin that we had complained of when it was done unto us. And we should know better after our experience of being misjudged and persecuted. And I grew determined to do better. And so I actually said, I don't know why these Christians claim to support Israel and claim to love the Jewish people, but I'm not going to rely on the anti-Christian stereotypes so prevalent in our community. I'm going to learn for myself the facts. And I did some things that I hadn't done unto that point in my life. I read the New Testament. I started showing up in the churches of pro-Israel Christians unannounced to see what they really said, not knowing a Jew was in the room. I read the books of pro-Israel Christians. I remember ordering the books and every tape about Israel from this gentleman named John Hagee in San Antonio, Texas. And after a couple of years of research, I realized that all the stereotypes about why Christians really support Israel in the Jewish community that were so prevalent and are prevalent until this very day are wrong and false and unfair. And the reality is something different, something much more beautiful. I found out that, and my argument is that Christians support Israel for the same reasons an Orthodox Jew supports Israel. It's not, it starts in the Bible, but not in the prophecies of the book of Revelation. It starts in a book called Genesis, in which God promises a land to Abraham and his seed through Isaac. And it's the promises of the book of Genesis that really motivate Christians to support Israel, much like they motivate Jews to support Israel. But what starts in the Bible doesn't end in the Bible. Evangelicals who support Israel have a real sense of Jewish history, the tragedy of Jewish history. And in their case, as opposed to the case of Orthodox Jews, it's spiked with a sense of guilt that so many of the tragedies to befall the Jewish people in our history were done by people claiming to be Christians. So it's a sense of the tragedy of Jewish history spiked by guilt. And then, of course, a sense of Israel's history and the justice of Israel's struggle for survival. And so this is support I concluded we as Jews should not only welcome, we should appreciate it. And a certain Jewish mitzvah, a certain Jewish commandment of hakarat hatov, recognizing the good that is done in the world, is incumbent upon us to approach our Christian friends and allies and say thank you.
How did you get to Pastor Hagee and to founding Christians United for Israel?
So, lots of interesting things happen in life. And as you know, when I was always somewhat of a secular fellow back in college and skeptical, as a good Princeton student should be. But, life does some things to you. And so I had written this book and I found a good Christian publisher for my book about why Christians support the Jewish state. And he invited me to an event he wanted to do in Florida called Standing with Israel event, a night to honor Israel. He wanted to do what Pastor Hagee had done in San Antonio for so many years. He invited me to speak. At that time, I was chief of staff for Arlen Specter, and it was a weeknight, and I couldn't leave my post to go fly to Florida. So I said, sorry, Steve Strang is the publisher. Sorry, Steve, I can't do it. Well, then one thing led to another, and I ended up leaving Senator Specter's office quicker than I had anticipated. He and I had some interesting disagreements. I called up Steve Strang and said, you know what, Steve? Turns out I can make your event after all. I flew down to his event. So there are two speakers that night, Pastor John Hagee and me. And after the event, Pastor Hagee came up to me and said, David, you clearly understand our community, the pro-Israel evangelical community. You understand the Jewish community, and you spent a decade in Washington. You understand Washington. I have a crazy idea. He said, for lack of a better term, I want to create a Christian AIPAC. Would you help me in this mission? What are you doing right now? And at the time, I was literally weighing options to lobby, be a lobbyist in Washington for this or that corporation. Nothing that really excited me too much. I jumped at the chance to help Pastor Hagee build what I felt could be a really important and really transformational organization. At the time, we had 0 employees, 0 members, and no money in the bank. But I was excited at the prospect because I believed that there were millions of Christians in America who, given a chance, would want to speak up and speak out for Israel. And if they only had a way, a path, an organization, they would take the opportunity to join. So on the basis of that belief, in a partnership with Pastor Hagee, who had labored for decades teaching Christians of the importance of supporting Israel and standing with the Jewish people, I jumped at it. And it turned out to be a wonderful chapter of my life.
And that chapter of your life, I think when we last checked, CUFI had something like 4 million members or something like that, right?
You're behind the times, Yoram. I think it's closer to 6 million now.
Okay, so and it's quite a remarkable achievement. And whether you're Christian or Jewish, if you have not been to these annual Christians United for Israel conferences in Washington. They are absolutely astonishing, truly moving. But David, let me push back just a little bit, because I can imagine people in the audience saying, what is this Jewish guy who, he read the New Testament and now he likes, now he likes Christians. Are you trying to tell us that, sort of across the board, that Christianity has completely changed, and that Christians just in general love Jews today? Is that the message?
It's an important clarification, Yoram. No, that's absolutely not the message. The message is that some Christians in some places support Israel and the Jewish people. And, we in the Jewish community should make the following very complex and strategic calculation. Those Christians who do embrace us and do support us, we should appreciate and join forces with. Those who continue to dislike us, we should keep our distance from. It sounds like a revolutionary idea, but we've been so, I think, as a people, Jews have, almost like we've been battered. We've been battered by history. We've been battered by the Gentiles we've lived amongst. And so I think we react in an unhealthy way sometimes. If someone comes to give us a hug, we recoil as if they're coming to hit us. We need to regain the healthy ability to distinguish between friend and foe. I often say the dominant theory in the Jewish community is that Christians are supporting Israel in a sense to perpetrate the Inquisition with a smiley face. We say they're doing it only to kill us or convert us by speeding the second coming of Jesus. That's simply not true. It's not true at a theological level. It's not true at a practical level. We need to get past this idea that everyone's out to get us. We need to understand that there's been a revolution in the way certain Christians view the Jewish people in Israel, and accept and embrace those who have changed their views towards us. But no, it's not all Christians. It's not even a majority of Christians in America, but I would say it's a plurality of evangelicals in America. And that's a lot of friends.
Let's move forward to what I think is your most significant book. You wrote a book called In Defense of Faith. And this is a book that really kind of hit me hard when I first read it. It's a rethinking of the history of the Bible, and especially Christianity, as it used the Bible and as it took biblical ideas into the development of the West. And this book is especially timely today because racism is the hot issue. It's the thing that everybody's talking about, and it's driving all sorts of movements in America and Britain and beyond. And here, a decade ago, you wrote this book in which you argued, and I thought quite persuasively, you argued that Christianity, in particular the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages and then going up to modern times, that Christianity had been a force against slavery, against racism. And I thought that was kind of an astonishing claim to make, but it's a scholarly book. It's got many hundreds of footnotes. All the you can look up the citations. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you came to write In Defense of Faith and what that book means?
So through working with Christians on behalf of Israel, it had a broader impact on my life because I started to again. Why do Christians living in Texas, and we had this multiple times, sell their car or forego their vacation to get the money with which to travel to Washington to lobby on behalf of Israel? Right? I found that to be a beautiful thing, that people were willing to make these personal sacrifices on behalf of other people they don't even know, living in a country far away. That's called altruism. It's a beautiful thing to see it in this world. And when we see it, I think we need to ask and understand, what is the source of it? It's a rare, precious thing. And I began to understand that Christianity was not just right in this one instance of supporting Israel. It was actually, there was a deeper set of morals and values at work that produced this altruistic support for Israel, but also produced altruism on other issues throughout history. And I began to see that my heritage, the Jewish heritage and the Christian faith, the Judeo-Christian idea, is something that has been a force for good and for altruism throughout history. So the norm is selfishness. The norm throughout history has been a self-centeredness and caring only about ourselves and our tribe, and being quite cruel and quite ruthless to those from outside of our tribe. What's interesting is what has caused us to transcend the selfishness, what has caused us to transcend the tribalism and actually care about other human beings. The only force that I have found in history that has consistently caused people to elevate their concerns and care about all of humanity beyond themselves, beyond their selfish genes, and beyond their tribe, has been the Judeo-Christian idea. And when you look through history, you can see that this has been a force for recognizing our shared humanity and reaching across tribal lines to fight the killing of people beyond our tribe, genocide, the enslaving of people beyond our tribe, slavery, and the persecution of people beyond our tribe, human rights and civil rights. And so I tell the story really throughout history of how it's only really been Christians who take their faith seriously. We Jews were a little preoccupied with our own survival to be human rights actors in the world until recently. But it's only been Christians who take their faith seriously, who fought against the genocide of Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere, who fought against the enslavement of Africans in Europe and America, and who have taken civil rights and human rights so seriously in the civil rights movement. And it's a consistent story throughout the centuries.
Can you give us an example or two so people have a more concrete view of what it is you're describing?
So when the Spaniards conquered the Western Hemisphere, the New World, they did not treat well the Native Americans they encountered. They murdered them. First of all, diseases wiped out a lot of them. That was not intentional, but they murdered a lot of them and enslaved the rest. And they didn't do this because they were nominal Christians. They did it despite their Christianity. They were greedy human beings who saw an opportunity to amass wealth. The only people to sort of stand astride the enslavement of the hemisphere and the murder of Native Americans and shout against it were devout Christians. They were the Catholic priests who were going over to the New World to minister to those building, the Europeans moving over there, and to try to share their faith with the natives. They stood astride and said, wait a second, you can't do this. These are fellow human beings created in the image of God. And they stood there amongst people who were in this frenzy of wealth and wealth creation, and said, these Indians are your brothers. And like Jesus says, you have to treat them as brothers. You cannot abuse them. And one individual in particular was so upset at the treatment of Native Americans that he sailed back to Spain. His name was Las Casas. Las Casas sailed back to Spain and demanded that the king stop the persecution of Native Americans in the New World. And the king of Spain wasn't sure what to do about this. And so he held a commission. He appointed a commission. It's not just a modern technique of politicians. It was an ancient technique. It was held in Valladolid, Spain. And he asked Las Casas to represent the side against persecuting Native Americans. And he asked a philosopher, Sepulveda, who was the leading expert on Aristotle in Spain. He had translated Aristotle into Latin to represent the other view. And so this modern classical philosopher, Sepulveda, invoked Aristotle and Aristotle's theories, because the Greeks didn't love their neighbors, Yoram. They enslaved their neighbors. And Aristotle came up with a philosophical justification for enslaving their neighbors by saying, our neighbors are barbarians. Our neighbors are not as sophisticated as we are. Our neighbors are not as rational as we are. They're dominated by their passions. Therefore, they're intended to be our slaves. And Sepulveda invoked Aristotle to say these Native Americans are not as sophisticated as we Spaniards. They're dominated by their passions. They're intended to be our slaves. It's okay to enslave them. Las Casas invoked the Bible and said, we're all created in the image of an almighty God. These are our brothers, and Jesus would have us do unto them only what we want done unto ourselves. We have to love them and embrace them. We dare not abuse them. They fought to a stalemate. The king never changed his policy, but this moment in time crystallized the very different views between the classical philosophers and this Judeo-Christian idea that we're all equal. We're all created in the image of God, and that we have to love our neighbors as ourselves, and we dare not do unto others what we don't want done unto ourselves. It was a classic conflict between these two ideas, a conflict we saw over and over again in subsequent centuries.
If we take a look at debates on this subject today, as you know, the universities are pretty hostile to the Bible, and one of the projects that our friends have been involved in over many years has been advancing scholarship that tries to show the influence of biblical ideas on Western civilization, where the mainstream of the scholarship is really not interested in that. It's really interested in saying, that there's this kind of Enlightenment superhighway that, goes from, ancient Greece to modern Germany, and that's where we get our ideas from. And so here, when you're describing the Bible against Aristotle, the view that you're presenting is almost the reverse of what's often presented in the universities, where the Bible is taken to represent darkness and unenlightenment and benightedness, and Aristotle is the beginning of the light. He's like the beginning of rationalism and enlightenment, and you've just reversed that for us. Now, are you saying that there is no universal reason that unites biblical thinking and Greek thinking that everybody in the world can just, appeal to?
So people invoke the classical philosophers to justify genocide and slavery in their day. But in more modern times, it was the Enlightenment philosophers who came up with the concept of race to justify slavery and genocide in their day. The whole concept of race and the people who developed it were modern Enlightenment philosophers. So we see throughout history the following. Thomas Jefferson, in writing our Declaration of Independence, wrote a beautiful thing. All men are created equal. A concept that comes from the Bible. But he prefaced it. Some say it was Benjamin Franklin's words, but we tend to give Jefferson credit for it. He said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." And I push back against that, because these ideas have not been self-evident. Very few human societies in the history of human civilization have ever accepted or believed that all men are created equal. Quite to the contrary, most civilizations throughout most of human history held that our tribe is superior, every other tribe is inferior, we can kill them, conquer them, enslave them. Cannibals did not love their neighbors, they ate them. The Greeks did not love their neighbors, they enslaved them. The Romans did not love their neighbors, they conquered them and enslaved them, and so forth through Enlightenment times. And so contrary to what others believe, the only source of this idea throughout history, that we are all equal, that the color of your skin is irrelevant, the place of your birth is irrelevant, that we are all, every one of us, created in the same image of the same Almighty God. It comes from just one source, whether you like it or not. And that source is the Bible that Jews and Christians share. And we have to give credit where credit is due. There might be other faults in our faiths and our histories, but this blinding, beautiful idea can be traced to no other source. And the only people who've taken this idea seriously enough to risk their lives for it, to sacrifice themselves for it, have almost exclusively been people who take their Jewish or Christian faith seriously. So when I meet someone, and I have people like college students, I meet college students a lot, And they say, I don't need religion to be a good person. I know to be a good person. I can be a good person on my own. I know murder's wrong. I know slavery is wrong. It just shows me, when you grow up in the middle of a Judeo-Christian society and throughout your life have been taught Judeo-Christian ideas, it's very easy to take for granted something that has been a rare idea throughout human history. And just to add one more point, Yoram, for people who say, okay, well, these ideas are out there now. Everyone has them now. We don't need the Bible anymore. Everyone has these ideas now. I just want to note something. The Romans, after they destroyed the temple in 70 AD, Tacitus, a Roman historian, he really disliked Jews and Judaism. And he wrote about some of the barbaric beliefs of the Jews, some of the horrible beliefs of the Jews. And one of them he really took issue with was the Jewish belief that it's always sinful to murder newborn babies. It really upset him because in Roman times it was very common to murder children you did not want, especially girls. That idea is an idea that comes exclusively from the Judeo-Christian idea. And in fact, Singer, the Princeton philosopher, Singer, Peter Singer, secular guy, has written the same thing. He says we have to get over this Christian idea, right? It's a Christian idea that it's wrong to murder newborn infants. We have to get over it because most societies throughout most of human history have murdered newborn infants. It's okay. They don't have much self-awareness. They don't have much self-consciousness. We should worry more about a 4-year-old dog than we do a newborn baby. And he's used the same idea in a very, I would argue, evil way to argue that it is a Christian idea, it is a Jewish idea, and one we have to get over. But it's a rare idea in human history. Well, studies have been done in China and India to this day showing that there is a tremendous gender gap. If you look at the rates with which girl babies and boy babies are born, you can extrapolate how many girls and boys should exist today in China, how many girls and boys should exist today in India. And most studies show about a gap of approximately 50 million girls in China, wow, about 50 million girls in India. Why? Because to this day, an idea persists that it's okay to murder newborn girls, or what's become more popular through science and ultrasounds is sex-selective abortions. You get an ultrasound, if it's a girl, you have an abortion. And it's produced a gender side in the modern era in China and India because these ideas persist. Because it is a very strange idea that it is wrong to murder a newborn baby. And as Peter Singer and as Tacitus understood, it comes from only one place, the Bible. And the people who find it offensive to murder a newborn baby girl should wake up and realize they only find it offensive because they've grown up in the heart of a Judeo-Christian civilization that taught them that it was offensive. We don't have any time in history where a cannibal just woke up one day and said, guys, I don't think we should eat Jim. I think it's wrong. He's a fellow human being. It never happened in history. The only time when cannibals stopped eating other tribes is when people came in with a very foreign and different idea, typically Christian missionaries. So you can fault missionaries, you can fault cultural imperialism, and there are issues there. But we have to remember this idea comes from one place, and it's a beautiful contribution that the Bible has made to the world.
David, I'd like to move over now to talking about national conservatism and the Edmund Burke Foundation. A few weeks ago, we had Professor Joshua Mitchell on the show, and he says, Yoram, do you remember that conference that we did in December 2016 where it all began? And that was the first conference that you and I did together. And it was Brexit had just happened a few months earlier, and Donald Trump a few weeks earlier. And there were about 50 or 60 of us in there in Glen Cove, Long Island, and we started trying to work out what eventually became National Conservatism, the Edmund Burke Foundation. You're now the president of the Edmund Burke Foundation. Why don't you share with us a little bit about how you came to be a NatCon and what it means to you?
Um, First of all, I mean, it's the most exciting political development in my life, our lives. And it's been such a great privilege to reconnect with you at this moment and discover that I think we both share this passion. I mean, we bonded in college over Israel and Judaism, and you planted some seeds of conservatism in my mind, and those seeds have grown. My story is basically this. I think I was shaped by growing up right outside of Atlantic City, New Jersey, which in retrospect I realize was post-industrial before post-industrial was a thing. Our industry was tourism. The people I grew up with came to that town, their parents came to that town because of tourism. The tourism industry in southern New Jersey was crushed with the advent of cheap air travel in the 1950s. Why go to Atlantic City or Asbury Park when you can fly to Florida or the Bahamas? Crushed. And so I grew up in a place where a lot of good, hardworking people simply led lives of desperation with no hope, with no future. And people talked about getting out and escaping, but not everyone could, and not everyone wanted to. And it gave me a sense at an early age that some of the bromides of free market absolutists don't work so well. That it's not just about hard work and enterprising attitudes. A lot of us are subject to our conditions, especially if you care about things like your community or your family and want to stay with them. I took that background and went to work for a guy named Arlen Specter. We discussed him earlier, in Pennsylvania, who was in certain ways not a great conservative, but in certain ways predated Donald Trump by 2 decades. One of the biggest battles we fought with Arlen Specter was the battle to save the steel industry in Western Pennsylvania from not fair trade. It's never about fair trade, from unfair trade, first by Japan and then from China. They were dumping steel onto the American market and crushing these industries. And I think because of my background, I felt an immediate connection with and compassion for the people in these steel communities across Western Pennsylvania who were good people, hardworking people. You know, the people Bruce Springsteen sings about, who sent their sons to war and come back and just want to work, but the factories are being closed. And for our troubles, I was basically excluded from proper conservative circles in Washington. I was called that most loathsome of names for a Republican in Washington. I was a squish because I was squishy on free market principles. And I didn't adhere sufficiently to my von Mises, and I didn't adhere sufficiently to the Vienna School of Economics, and instead wanted to intervene to put quotas on foreign steel or tariffs on foreign steel, and do something to enable the good people of Western Pennsylvania to support their families without having to abandon their families and their communities. And I really was excluded. I remember I worked on the Hill in the 90s. I tried to get jobs on some of the presidential campaigns, the 2000 cycle. And I was well liked. I was a popular guy. I didn't get any callbacks. And I remember asking a friend once why. He was on one of the campaigns. He said, like, you're a Specter guy, you're a squish. We this is a Republican primary. We can't have you on the team. It wouldn't look good. So I grew disillusioned with American politics. I thought, if I can't find a home, I'm not a Democrat. I reject most of their policies, but yet I'm being shunned by my party, the Republican Party, because I want to do something for the people who seem to me to be the backbone of this country and could be the backbone of our party, the working class. And it was just a lonely voice, and I had no home. And so, as you know, I left the Hill. I ended up spending a decade and a half focused just on the issue of Israel until we met again. Until Donald Trump, like him or dislike him, proved that this free market orthodoxy, this elevation of this ideology of perfect free markets that is so much at odds with the reality in which we live, is not a necessary part of a conservative coalition and is not a necessary part of winning elections. And he actually brought back this idea that I fought for with Specter in the 90s and early 2000s of fighting for working class Americans, fighting against unfair trade practices, fighting to provide futures for people in their communities with their families. And this was an exciting breakthrough. For once, we were no longer the outsiders, the squishes. On this issue, we had taken over the party again and taken over the movement again. And it created this wonderful opportunity. And ever since, I think we've been working about how do we seize it? How do we make sure the Conservative Party in America, the Republican Party in America, will be the national party in America? One that cares for the nation and the interests of the nation above abstract ideals, which good conservatives should always be skeptical, like perfectly working free markets. And it creates the opportunity of making the Republican Party, the Conservative Party, the national party, what it always should be, the party of the working class. Which is, this is something in my wilderness years. I read a lot of Disraeli, and Disraeli summed it up perfectly. How did the conservatives survive the expansion of the franchise in Great Britain? How did the Conservative Party, the party of the landed gentry, actually win elections as the vote was given to everyone, every male in Great Britain? It survived because Disraeli saw, and he captured this beautifully. He said the working class is actually a conservative class. And he said this back in the 1800s. He said the following, he said, the working class is proud of living in a great country, wants to maintain the greatness of their country, and recognizes that the greatness of the country is connected to its ancient traditions. And that to me is a summary of what the National Party, the Conservative Party, should be all about. He was talking about greatness well before Trump, but he said the working class is proud of living in a great country, wants to maintain its greatness, and recognizes that the greatness is tied to the ancient traditions of Britain. I think the working class in America is proud of living in a great country. They want to maintain our greatness, and they recognize that there's a connection between our greatness and our institutions and our founding ideals.
So this brings us to this splendid new essay, really a tour de force that you just published a few weeks ago in American Affairs magazine. The essay is called "Up from Laissez-Faire: Reclaiming Conservative Economics," and it really is kind of a tour from Hamilton to Disraeli and onward, where you use these great conservative figures in order to argue that there is such a thing as conservative economics, and it's not what people think. Share a little bit about that with us.
So I started reading Disraeli, and I thought, this is fantastic. I'm not the only one. It led me to want to read more. I read some of Burke's writings, Reflections on the Revolution in France, and was quite impressed. And I began to grow curious. Okay, we have this conservative movement, these conservative thinkers. So what did some of them think about free market versus the national interest? And it was really quite a stunning revelation to me. Again, in those days, there was like a lock grip on the Republican Party by people I would call free market fundamentalists, in that they elevated the ideals above the reality. We've never lived in a free trade reality. And so reading Burke was quite a revelation for me, because we can all agree in a sense he was the most prominent of the founders of conservative movement. You and Ophir have done a wonderful job of showing us how conservatism preceded Burke. But Burke is sort of the popular founder in the popular mind. Burke's guiding principle, if I had to sum it up, was nationalism. Burke's overriding purpose of Burke's politics was the grandeur and the glory of Britain, he wrote. And his sole guiding principle was what is in the best interest of my country, and in his day, the empire. And so when it came to economics, he was quite clear and quite explicit. Free markets are good. He was a free market guy. He was friends with Adam Smith. Adam Smith respected Edmund Burke. But to a point. And that point was when free markets no longer serve the interest, the greatness and glory of my country. And then I'm going to put my country's interests above an absolute idea of free markets. So he supported some of the restrictions on trade for British colonies. He wanted the colonies to be able to export, but he wanted to require them to stop in London on their way home so that they would bring back British-made manufacturers, not French-made manufacturers, and not other manufacturers. He supported other restrictions on the economics of the colonies. He didn't want them building industries that competed with Britain. But when the industries would not compete with Britain, he wanted to support and subsidize new industries in the colonies. But his whole model was a model of what furthers our economic interests, not some abstract, placing an abstract ideal above those interests. By the way, even Adam Smith recognized times when you need subsidies and tariffs. Even he recognized that in an imperfect world of imperfect trade, there are times when countries need to do these things. And so the interplay between Burke and Smith was quite interesting and quite liberating. And then when you look to American shores, who was Burke's contemporary? Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was operating in a very different system. He wasn't trying to maintain the British empire and economic system. He was trying to fight it and get out of it and liberate us from it. But the same principles applied. He was a free market guy, supported free markets, but only so far as it furthered our economic interests. And the minute he saw that our economic interests would not be well served in the absence of tariffs to protect us from established British manufacturers, or in the absence of subsidies to enable our industries to grow and compete, he came in and said the government must intervene for the best interests of our nation. And his policy on manufacturers has gotten famous, but he called for protective tariffs, he called for subsidies, he called for building up industries, he even called for bringing expertise from London, from England to America to help us build up our industries. He called for, I know it's been out of fashion, he called for an industrial policy because the times necessitated it. And I think something strange happened during the Cold War. But during the Cold War, as we were fighting communism abroad and socialism at home, a free market absolutism entered the conservative movement. It entered the conservative movement at a time when we were the dominant industrial power. So what appealed at the ideological level when fighting communism and socialism, a free market absolutism, also worked at the practical level. When you're the dominant industrial power, then insisting on complete free trade and free markets is actually in your economic self-interest. So this confluence of events, I think, led to an unusual, I grew up thinking this was the way it is. It was actually an unusual moment in the conservative movement and conservative history where free market absolutism gained a dominant position in the movement that it did not traditionally occupy. But things have changed since then. The Cold War is over. There is a bit of a socialist threat at home, but the Cold War is over. And we're no longer the dominant industrial power. And therefore, what served our economic interests some decades ago no longer does serve our economic interests. I would argue today we're in a position much closer to the position Alexander Hamilton faced and Henry Clay faced than the position Ronald Reagan faced. And therefore, we need to look to them for some answers instead of the reflex, still pretty powerful reflex, to only look back to Reagan. Circumstances change. There are other conservatives. We can learn from them.
You know, you mentioned Reagan, and I've actually been reading up some on the end of the Cold War and Cold War conservatism recently. And, you know, it takes me back to, the days when we were at Princeton and Ronald Reagan was president and Margaret Thatcher was prime minister. And the thing is, you know, we founded this Reaganite magazine at Princeton called the Princeton Tory. And the strange thing is that the Princeton Tory, you know, we certainly, published articles on economics that were influenced by Milton Friedman and even Ayn Rand. That certainly existed. But the dominant spirit at the Princeton Tory was national conservative. We were, followers of Irving Kristol, who wrote a book called Two Cheers for Capitalism. And his arguments are extremely similar to yours. I mean, Irving Kristol's position throughout his career was that that the free market is the best source of producing wealth, but that without religious and national tradition, without a constant focus on religion and on the nation, that the free market would undermine everything. All of that, the pro-religion, pro-nation conservatism, that was actually the way that I and a lot of the people working with me, that was the way that we experienced Ronald Reagan.
I remember the Tory well, and I should credit it perhaps in the evolution of my thought, because it was an unusual position at the time. And circumstances at the time did. I mean, it was okay to elevate these ideas, but we're conservatives. We should be looking at our history. And it is a bit disconcerting to see conservatives, people who revere history, revere our founding, begin in 1980. There is this history, this rich, beautiful history that precedes 1980. You know, I always found, it was somewhat of a shallow inspiration, but I always took great inspiration from Bruce Springsteen. He grew up at, in Asbury Park, close to where I grew up. He sang about the kind of people I grew up with. He is, I think, some of the most beautiful. His songs explain the plight of some of the working men in America and some of these dying cities better than almost any artist in America today. One of his songs, Youngstown, is, I think, perhaps the most beautiful poem about working class Americans I've read, or it's a beautiful song. But what a joy it was for me to discover that there was another poet, another leader in American Republican history who also understood, recognized, and fought for the common man, the working man. His name was Abraham Lincoln. Hamilton and Henry Clay were motivated by our rivalries with foreign countries. They saw that British industry could crush our industry. We needed to protect ourselves from it, and we needed to support local industries to compete with it. Their nationalism came from an international competition. Lincoln had a very different nationalism. Lincoln grew up in a depressed region. He grew up in the Midwest at a time when the Midwest was not connected to commerce. And he saw that good men were being crushed, hardworking men were being crushed because they had no way of building wealth. They could not bring their goods to market. They couldn't bring their produce to market. He became a Henry Clay nationalist, an American system nationalist, dedicated to building infrastructure and building industries, not out of a sense of rivalry with a foreign country, but out of a sense of identification with the common man. He wanted a right to rise in this country. He wanted an equality of opportunity in this country, and he passionately championed these things. And he became sort of a beautiful poet in the cause of the right to rise in America. This is part of our heritage. This is part of our conservative heritage. This is part of our Republican heritage. We should celebrate it.
National conservatism, when we got started in 2016, you and me, we kind of thought that the playing field was going to be liberal internationalists, versus a resurgent national conservatism. I mean, that was the way we saw it. We even co-authored an essay on the subject. And today, that landscape has shifted. The landscape has shifted. Nobody can say after 2020 that the old liberalism is still hegemonic. The old liberalism, we thought it was going to, go on and on. But the truth is that there's a new woke neo-Marxism in town, and it has been breathtakingly successful with astonishing speed. Has put the great liberal institutions in America and Britain and now in Europe under the thumb of this new revolutionary ideology. And national conservatism is going to have to compete with that, because that's the main thing that's happening. How do you see national conservatives? How do you see national conservatism going forward on this new playing field?
Well, it's your point is well taken. By the way, your article, Yoram, comparing the woke mob that took over our cities this summer to Marxists, pointing out their Marxism was a very important article for me. I didn't fully understand the phenomenon until I read your article and saw the similarities in ideology, substituting race for class, and you have now an explanation through Marxism. You know, it's troubled me for years. My work has been focused on college campuses, and I've been arguing to people that a lot of the insanity we see on college campuses, you know, in a generation, we're going to see in our politics, in our streets. I was wrong, of course. It didn't take a generation. It's there now, and it's a big threat. And we're seeing a new tribalism emerge in our politics, a desire to break us up once again according to our skin color, according to our race. And to me, it's something very brutal and very ugly. Very much against this Judeo-Christian idea we were talking about earlier in our conversation, but the idea that these things are irrelevant, that all that matters is our equality, that we're all created in the image of this mighty God. But I think the challenge for us, and I think the opportunity for us, is to join this debate with a better definition of the tribe. The tribe is not people of a certain skin color or people of a certain national origin. The tribe for me, as an American, are the American citizens. I think, you know, why do we call ourselves nationalists and not just patriots? And I think, to me, the appeal of the term nationalist is it elevates the nation and the bond I share with every one of my fellow citizens to a higher spiritual plane. And there's a spiritual element to politics. It's not just all about, you know, lower taxes. There's a spiritual element to politics. There's a soul craft to politics, if I can steal George Will's term. And to me, nationalism elevates what we share and what we love to that higher plane. And it says, in my life, when I look at what's important to me in my life, it's my family, it's my faith, but it's also my nation. The nation that's protected me, the nation that's given me opportunities, and the citizenship that ties me in a deep, mystical way to every fellow American. And if we take that seriously, if I say the bond I have with my fellow American is something deep and precious and mystical, it can overcome the racism that lingers, that divides us by race and says there's something that should separate me from my fellow citizen. And it can overcome the new racism that purports to help and uplift, but only divides and sours. And I think we can compete in the marketplace of ideals with a tribalism that defines the tribe the proper way, the national way, and that unites us. And if this sounds silly or dreamy, you know, I'd point out what happens in the American military. The American military, you've got guys putting their lives on the line for one another. They don't care about the race of their fellow soldier. They don't care about the politics of their fellow soldier. They just care that each of them are Americans fighting for this country. They have each other's back. They are bound together. They're brothers. I don't think it's impractical. I don't think it's impossible to dream that we can all feel a deeper connection to one another, a deeper bond through one another through a heightened sense of nationalism, through a heightened sense of national purpose and bonds. That to me is the promise in America of what we're doing together through the Edmund Burke Foundation.
So you began your career in Republican politics, and now when you look at the Republican Party today, all right, we've been through 4 years of Donald Trump in the United States, and Brexit is finally happening, it seems, in Britain 4 years later, and still there are open questions. You know, where do you see the Republican Party going now? Right, can you answer that for us?
So to me, I think it's clear, and again, you don't have to love the personality of Donald Trump to appreciate things he got right. Imperfect people get things right. He got some things right. And one of the things he got right is that the Republican Party, the Conservative Party, needs to be the national party, the party of the working class in America. I think the future of the Republican Party is as Trump would have it, as Lincoln would have it, as Disraeli would have it. recognizing that where is the real source of nationalism in our country? It's not the universities. It's not the suburbs. It's the working class that still has this pride in living in a great country. They want to maintain our greatness, and they have enough respect for and knowledge of our history to understand that our greatness comes from our institutions and our ancient founding documents. This to me is the source of hope in America. Both parties are guilty of ignoring the working class, of neglecting the working class, of condescending to the working class. I think the future of the Republican Party is in people who will respect our working class and take seriously their challenges and fight for them. There are limits to what we can do, you know? I mean, we are free market people, but there are limits to free markets, especially in a flawed world where there is not free trade. And there's so much we can do to stand up and defend our industries and defend our workers and to recognize their challenges and stand with them. I think that's the future of the Republican Party. And that Trump got right. And I think any Republican who recognizes this, seizes on this, and represents this can offset some of the votes we're losing among college grads and those poisoned by the universities with votes of the real source of American nationalism, the American worker.
David Brog. Catch you next time on NatConTalk.
Great to be with you, Yoram. Thanks for having me.